Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and a warm welcome to you. I'm very excited to be here with you today, and I'd like to start by thanking you, the participants, for joining us, as well as the distinguished group of speakers, and in particular our hosts, OCHA and SDC, for providing us with this venue. I'm Justin Ginnetti from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and I'll be moderating today's event. In just a few moments, you're shortly going to hear from Leonardo Milano, Predictive Analytics Team Lead at OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data, Debbie Guha-Sapir, the Director of CRED and the founder of MDAT Database, James Douris, the Project Officer for Multi-Hazard Early Warning Services at the WMO, Animesh Kumar, Deputy Chief of UNDRR Office for Asia Pacific, soon to be in Bonn, and Rajesh Sharma, Program Specialist for Disaster Risk Information and Applications at UNDP in Bangkok, Pierre Chrzanowski, Disaster Risk Management Specialist at the World Bank's GFDRR, Alex Gaus, Project Manager for the Global Public Policy Institute, Lorenzo Masacchielli, Senior Emergency Planning and Response Officer from the Italian Red Cross, and Cassie Stilo, Enterprise Data Lead for the Pacific Disaster Center in Maui. Thanks. So, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements, which I will paste shortly into the Q&A function. But we will be using the Q&A for you to post all of your questions and comments, and we'll be monitoring this throughout the event. All of the presentations and a recording of this event will be made available, as will the list of participants. And to ensure that you receive the information, please add your name and contact details to the sign-in sheet, which you'll see in the Q&A as well. And finally, you can access the subtitles and closed captioning using the settings on your screen. So I'll just go ahead and do that now for you all. There we are. Anna Marie, if you can advance to the next slide, please. Thanks. So, to set the scene, as IFRC set out to enhance our existing systems, we shared our plans, a schema for which you see here, with several of our partners with whom we hope to collaborate. We soon realized that we were all working on different pieces of the same puzzle: disaster data and the standards for collecting, sharing, and analyzing it. Thus, rather than launching a new initiative, today's event will explain how a group of institutions with shared interests intend to collaborate and coordinate with each other so that we have a more comprehensive global understanding of disasters, from the hazards that trigger them to their impacts, as well as how we respond. Next slide, please. At IFRC, investment in an improved disaster database will help support several strategic objectives: scaling up anticipatory action, helping national societies deliver in their communities, and facilitating a network-wide digital transformation. The range of anticipatory actions IFRC engages in, shown here on the right, requires the use of models, and we need observational data about past events in order to validate and calibrate these forward-looking models. So this data, covering all 192 of our national societies, is absolutely essential. Next slide, please. A more comprehensive disaster database will enable the national societies to understand the risks that they face, especially those risks associated with small and medium-sized hazards that they usually have to respond to without international assistance. This database will also help them better understand the drivers of these risks, learn from past events and from their peers, and to support decision-making and resource mobilization and allocation. Next slide, please. The database can also help improve national societies' capacity to use data analytics, and having the data is obviously the first step for this. Because some of our national societies have already developed systems for collecting, storing, analyzing, and visualizing disaster data, This represents a great opportunity to accelerate a digital transformation through peer-to-peer learning across the entire network. Next slide, please. For the IFRC use case, we envisage having 3 kinds of information in our disaster database. Information about the time and date, location, and intensity of hazard events, their impacts, and how we responded. The first 2 kinds of this data will come from partners who are about to speak, and these will be public goods. Even if national society's operational data isn't yet available to everyone, we do hope that the insights derived from our analysis of it can be shared with everyone and also become a public good. Next slide, please. So that's it in terms of the scene setting for me. Thanks very much for your attention. And now on with the rest of the show. And let's see if Leonardo is not yet online, it doesn't seem like he is, we will skip right over to Debbie and then come back to Leonardo's slides, Anna Maria, after Debbie has spoken. So Debbie, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Justin, for having invited me to this session, and of course, thank you to everyone else for attending this at what seems like a fairly early hour. So, with that, I will jump into. I don't have any slides. And so I will just make 3 points, which I think may be relevant for the discussions. I very much applaud this initiative taken by the IFRC on trying to consolidate and bring together a joined up approach to disaster data collection. And I just go over very briefly my 3 points, and then we can discuss them in greater detail later on. The lessons that I have learned from having directed MDAT for so many years is that at one point, I mean, MDAT is become by default actually a very rare database that covers all countries, all disasters, and in a more or less systematic way. I say more or less because if you start looking into some details, you will find that there are differences, but that's the way it is. But it does supply some of the main policymaking, global policymaking processes with global data. Now, at this time, one of the biggest gaps that we are facing and that really needs to be addressed is the acquirement of better quality data. Quality of data is extremely important because it is on that quality of data that the credibility and the usage depends. If the users cannot depend on the credibility and the quality of the data, then they will simply not use it, or it can be sort of broken down very quickly because people will say, oh, well, this is not right and that's not right and so on and so on. So better quality data is extremely important, and this links up to what will be my 3rd point. The second point is that it is really time and a little bit beyond time. I mean, I think we're running a little bit behind for the use, like widespread use, not just, one boutique initiative or a study by MIT or something like that, not that kind of use, a widespread use of new technologies and development of new methods. One of the problems with low quality data is that methods are very, very weak for certain kinds of information. So when Justin spoke about impact, his slides said about impact data very often consists of 2 big components. One is human impact and the other is economic impact. There are other kinds of information that we have, but let's say for argument's sake, those are the 2. Now, human impact, okay, over years, it's more or less clear what they're including, but there's still weaknesses, but it will never be perfect. Economic methods are extremely weak. And, we can discuss this. It's an extremely important component. Methods are extremely weak. New technologies like satellite, data sources have become cheap, and the data processing has become much more simple. And this would actually help tremendously in expanding the reach of the data and having an independent source of the impact. There are other methods which we use in epidemiology, sentinel systems and modeling. You get sentinel reporting, and then you use that sentinel reporting to model your response. One last thing I want to say about this on this point is that methods is not the same thing as software. They're two different things. And what has happened in the past, I've noticed, is that software gets, or an application, if you like, gets confused with a method. Not the same thing. Not the same thing. And this has to be kept in mind. Method comes first, and application or software comes after that. It is simply a transformation. A software is simply a transformation of a strong method for data collection. My third and last point is the idea of consortium approach, which is what the Federation is putting forward now, the consortium approach. It is probably the most important issue right now, because it's not only that people are working in parallel. What is more important is that very often those parallels actually overlap. And this means duplication of work. This means contradictory information. It means just confusion in the entire disaster data world, if you like, on the radar screen. So I think a consortium approach, which brings together some of the main data suppliers or data consolidators, would be a huge step forward right now. I think we've let about 15 years go by with everybody trying out different things, but now it's really time to bring it together. And ideally, it should be brought together in concentric levels of interoperability. So in other words, there should be a system which links up local level data to regional level data, well, not regional, sorry, regional hubs where local level data are consolidated, validated, checked for technical accuracy, and then eventually global data. I mean, global data for MDAT and I don't know who else, Munich Re and so on and so forth, will simply plod on anyway. But I think the best would be to create this chain of concentric circles, remembering that data collection is a very, very labor-intensive process, and one has to be very careful about how much one burdens local level personnel on data collection issues. I think that's more or less what I have to say. I think we have to work towards a collaborative agreement. This can only be possible if it can only be possible on a specific level if there are a few groups who actually produce data, who agree to work together. And then once we have reached a collaborative agreement, we can actually implement a joined up database. Justin, with that, I thank you for your attention to everybody, and thank you for Justin again for having me over.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for joining us and for those perspectives, and from speaking from such a vast experience of your own. No one has been doing this for as long and as well as MDAT, so really thanks very much. We have Leonardo on the line now and resolved the IT. So over to you, Leonardo, who is the head of the predictive analytics team at OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data. Leonardo, over to you.
Thank you, Justin, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, thanks. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to kind of give our perspective on this, on the importance actually of this this initiative. And I would like to start maybe from the work that the Center for Humanitarian Data, that is part of OCHA, is doing around data. So that the center has been established with a very clear and simple objective to increase the speed, the use, and the impact of data in humanitarian response. And this is very much, what is our mission statement, if you want. And you probably know the center because we're making a huge effort to make fresh data and reliable data available for humanitarian response. So we the target audience that we had in mind when we started the work, and I think we can go to the next slide, thanks. When we started, when we created HDX, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, was really to provide first responders with the most reliable and the latest data on a given situation. And over time, HDX has become really the place to go if you want the one-stop shop for humanitarian data. So, but you know, over time, and this is really helpful, and this is the information that during a disaster, the operational partners need. You probably know, and you know, over the past few years, the Federation and a number of NGOs and UN agencies are trying to shift from a reactive way of responding to humanitarian crisis to a more proactive, anticipatory way of responding to crisis. And I think we can go to the next slide. So, you know, this is actually the work that started already several years ago by IFRC with the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, with the START Network, WFP, FAO. And now also OCHA is implementing what we call anticipatory action frameworks in several contexts. And the idea is really to, instead of acting on an assessment of needs, humanitarian organizations and donors, and you know, also the funding mechanisms, are more and more interested in acting on the basis of risk. So when the risk is high enough, then this would generate, you know, this would trigger, you know, immediately humanitarian funding and humanitarian response. So usually when we talk about, you know, anticipatory action, we always present it in a way that, you know, there are three main components. One is the trigger, that is really like the risk information that is used. The second one is the money, a financing mechanism, and the third one is an action plan that is already pre-established. Now, if the system is shifting and is now ready to act on risk, then that's really where, you know, having an historical, having a better understanding and having you know, historical data on what were the events that impacted, you know, a given country in the past, what was the scale, what were the main humanitarian needs, becomes very important. And I just want to conclude to say that really this element is key to enable and to implement successfully this, you know, this agenda on anticipatory action. So the first one is, if we want to act on risk, first of all, we need to have a good understanding of what is the probability of a given event. Usually we think in terms of return period. So what's the likelihood of a given event happening in a given place, and what's the expected impact? So, and this is, if you want, what we call the baseline risk. But now when we have a specific forecast, so we move more from the concept of probability, and we know that a given shock, a given event is about to happen or is very likely to happen. If we want to implement successfully, you know, actions that will mitigate its impact, then we need to have a better understanding of the scale of a given event. And that's, you know, the best way is really to look at past events, because, you know, most of these shocks have been already observed in the past, and we know sort of what was the impact in the past. So, and that's really where, you know, there's a major gap, and that's where I think all humanitarian agencies will benefit from. And this is definitely, you know, something that is complementary to the work that we're doing with the Humanitarian Data Exchange and really like providing the latest data. We also need to remember that we need to also have, I mean, keep the memory of what happened in the past, to successfully implement humanitarian action in the future. So let me stop here and give the floor back to you, Justin, and then I'm happy to take questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leonardo. Really good to hear your perspective and about how this is being positioned, particularly within the humanitarian architecture and agenda. The need for the shift for acting on risk rather than just responding, and then what needs to be in place in order for this to happen. We're going to actually sort of structurally reinforce this shift from hazard to risk by starting with Jim Douris from WMO, and then moving over to our colleagues who do indeed work on the risk dimension of this. So first, over to you, Jim, to talk about the Cataloging of Hazardous Events initiative. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some information about the WMO Cataloging and Hazardous Events initiative. Next slide, please. So what is it? What is the WMO Cataloging of Hazardous Events initiative? It's an initiative. The initiative is a service that will benefit countries in their national loss and damage stakeholders, such as the disaster management authorities, providing them with hazard event information that is scalable, granular, and usable. Next. Next slide, please. Next slide. So why is the WMO, or how is the WMO going to be doing this? We'll be using or leveraging the WMO standardized or operational network to be able to do this. But essentially, what is the issue? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And that is attribution and context of a recorded loss is not normally accurately associated with causal hazard. This is done normally through newspapers and etc. What we're trying to do from the WMO side is look at it from the physical phenomena perspective only, aside from the impact side. So take an example for Typhoon Haiyan or El Nino. Next slide, please. Haiyan, I'm sure many of you know that it was extremely, it was a terrible event that caused over 6,000 deaths, 14 million people affected, and $850 million in damage. How are the losses and damages attributed to each causal hazard in a systematic and authoritative way? By that meaning, what damage was associated with wind or storm surge, rain, flooding, disease, outbreak, loss of power? Can we actually itemize the damage according to that, the loss and damage that is? How do we ensure that loss and damage is recorded over the lifespan of the hazard? Impacts from all countries, the Philippines, and the Vietnam, SIDS, etc. So looking at it from a global perspective. El Nino, prolonged drought in Asia and heavy rain in South America. How do we actually bring these two together to be able to quantify an El Nino event? And this is really the target of the initiative from WMO. Please, next. So what are the goals? The goals are strengthening members, meaning countries' capabilities to record weather, climate, water, and space weather events, or the hazards themselves, in their lifetime in a systematic way for forensic meteorology, liability claims, research, and many other disciplines. It's also the WMO's contribution for monitoring of the global agenda and strengthening of members' disaster management capacities and multi-hazard early warning systems through improved risk-based information. And also to strengthen the WMO leadership in hydrometeorological and climate-related hazards through the provision of agreed upon list of types of events and associated impacts that are under their mandate. Please, next. So how is it structured? Next. There are 4 key aspects to the methodology. One is the uniqueness of an event record. What we did was we took meaning away from the event ID and made it a standardized randomized number with attributes. So this allows for recording of events uniquely. So yeah, sorry. The next one is the events list. For WMO, we will have an extended list of events or hazards. You can put hazards in that part. It's a living list defining the topology of events that could have impact on society. Scalable enables empirical linking of events to better reflect the larger system, or we call it the synoptic scale, or the large scale systems that move through. And then is flexible, provides flexibility for addressing regional and national specificities. Next, please. This is right here. I won't go into it completely, but we have the hazard, and then we have the event record with various parameters associated with it, and then we have the event database. That, coupled with the loss and damage community database, will provide a full set of data. But this is really a service for the loss and damage community to be able to attribute more accurately what the damage was caused by. Next, please. The WMO events list is a list of events that is from the WMO as far as under the hazards under their mandate. And it is not intended to be hierarchical. It is a flat list and can be amended by countries and regions through the appropriate WMO mechanism if it's 193 countries. And it synergizes with the UNDRR IFC Hazard Definition and Classification Review paper, and the link is there for you to look at. Please, next. This is the initial list. I won't get into each one. Please, next. One of the nice things about the methodology is the ability to link event to event. So there's a linkage parameter which allows for instance, where the tropical cyclone, you have heavy rain, flooding, storm surge, and other hazards as well. The loss and damages associated with, for instance, the heavy rain or flooding and storm surge can be linked to the larger scale tropical cyclone. And if you put, for instance, El Nino in there, you could imagine at the national level, you would have also events that link to the El Nino, and this methodology allows for this to take place, to be linked. Please, next. This here is the operational system that we are developing. It is still in negotiation, but this gives you the general idea. Please, next. So applications, layering of information. Layering of information enables new possibilities for analysis and application, provides a platform for higher quality impact-based forecasts, enhanced research into the historical relation between and among hazards, the detailed hazard and impact information for risk analysis, higher granularity of data. Many other applications are also involved here. Go to the next slide. Tracking global policy indicators. For instance, do we know that the number of thunderstorms are increasing or have had more damage associated with them or have caused more lives to be lost? Risk management, risk identification, hazard component, empirical methodology for understanding hazards, and risk reduction. For understanding and quantifying past events as input into developing building standards. And then risk transfer, insurance, risk facilities, and cat bonds. Also, one of the applications to this is the research, tracking of event trends and frequency and severity and distribution, and also on causal contribution of hazards and exposure and vulnerability to losses. It also provides a gateway to being able to understand complex hazard events. Please, next. We have implemented this, and these instances are still going in Southeast, in the Southeast Pacific, or Southwest Pacific, sorry. We have it in Indonesia and in Australia. These events records, and I won't get into it fully, you can go to the website and try it out yourself. They were able to put together a year's worth of data, past historical data, into the database of hazardous events within about a week, and that for Indonesia and for Australia. And they continue to record these events as we go. The applications, from what I understand from Indonesia, have already impacted their disaster management policies and awareness. Please, next. Also in Europe, we have the Kroner database that has implemented this methodology. And as you can see here, they have a different way of portraying it, but the data is the same as far as the unique identifier with the associated parameters for each event and the linkage parameter to the higher level system. Please, next. Thank you very much. I'll be open to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was really exciting. I think that the work that you guys are doing, standardizing this catalog of hazards and events is really a critical part of the puzzle, and is essential for all of us. And it's one of those things where if WMO can take this on and deliver this as a service to the rest of us, it really would be enormously helpful. And I think what was really exciting too was the sense of the scale that you were able to illustrate there, particularly at the end. You know, when we think about many of these disaster databases that exist, at least at the global level, including that at IFRCs, it has a relatively small number of events, whereas what you showed for just Indonesia alone is a good indication of what the true scale of the phenomena really are. So with that in mind, let me now turn over to Animesh and Rajesh, who will speak exactly on that topic. Over to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Justin, for inviting us to this very interesting session. This is a joint presentation by UNDP and UNDRR on Disaster Information Management System called DesInventar. My name is Rajesh Sharma, and I am from the Crisis Bureau of UNDP. I'm joined by my colleague Animesh Kumar from UNDRR, who is going to present immediately after me. Next slide, please. So as many of you may know about DesInventar, Disaster Information Management System, which was established as a standalone system way back in 1990s. And this system has been undergoing various upgrades since then. And then, of course, now it is developed as an online version, which is currently used in almost like 112 countries and territories around the world, which includes small island countries, least developed countries, and various like landlocked countries. The way this system works is basically is based on the principle of collection of homogeneous data from all disaster events of all sizes, small, medium, large. And the data is collected in a disaggregated manner at local level. And also the system allows visualization of data through a series of maps, charts, and various kind of graphics. Let me quickly illustrate to you a disaster loss and damage system installed by UNDP in a country called Cambodia. Next slide, please. Now you see this graphics generated by Cambodia database called CAMD, and this system has been institutionalized at Government of Cambodia for the last 5 years. This is being managed by National Government of Cambodia called NCDM, the responsible body for disaster risk reduction in the country. and it includes data for last 20 years from year 2000 onwards. Now you see on your screen, there is a map on the left side of the screen, which shows basically in the dark color the areas where most people have died from disasters in the country, disaggregated at local level. So one can easily identify areas where in last 20 years, most people have been killed by disasters in the country. And this database includes 8 types of disasters. Now the pie charts at the bottom of the screen are very interesting. This provides a very interesting, useful insights, which were very, very relevant to all the stakeholders, including the government. The pie chart on the left side shows the 5 top disasters in the country out of total 8 disasters in the system. Now, when we look at the impact of these disasters, it was very insightful that flood came out to be the #1 killer, and second one was lightning. Though lightning in terms of occurrence appears at the 5th place, but when it comes to killing people, impacting people, it is #2. And it was very, very insightful because nobody knew about this, because the impact of lightning is always impacting like 1%, 2%, very small numbers scattered throughout the country. When we go deeper into the analysis of this database, we are able to identify during which months people get killed and in what part of the country. So for the purpose of reducing mortality, this basically points to policymakers, decision makers, that where they should intervene to reduce the mortality. Next slide, please. So we have been implementing this, maybe we can move to next slide. So we have been implementing this system for a number of years around the world, but then we have been realizing that a lot has changed over years and decades, and we need to have a different system which can respond to current needs. So what has changed over the years? Compared to in the past, we were single hazard focused. Now we are more multi-hazard focused. And we have all witnessed in all our countries and the various kind of disasters we are facing, including the current ongoing COVID crisis. And also due to complex nature of risk, cascading events, there is a necessity of engaging with a wider group of agencies and more targeted functionality and outputs than in the past. We also see due to technologies, data volumes are increasing, and it has now become possible to collect data from variety of sources due to new technologies such as crowdsourcing data and satellite data, etc. But there are not matching capacities for analyzing it at country level at various levels around the world. So now I will stop here and pass on to my colleague Animesh.
Thanks, Rajesh, and thanks, Justin, as well, for accommodating UNDP and UNDRR in this very interesting group of people. We are very much keen to collaborate, and where are we as of now after 25 years of experience implementing a disaster loss database being used by around 100+ countries, is to essentially meet the demand and to meet the changing and rapidly diversifying demand that we are seeing as of now. So a lot of this demand has been actually fueled by the growing needs for standardization of data because of the Sendai Framework Monitor and its linkage with the SDG Monitor, which remains to be a primary purpose of many of these databases that the governments are using. Indeed, unless we tell the world how are we faring against disaster risk reduction over decades, we're actually not measuring our own performance. So in the last Secretary General's report, it was noted that the mortality per 100,000 people decade to decade has declined from 1.8 to 1.10 per 100,000 people. That is the kind of information we should be able to generate, but not at the global level, but at the national and local level. And only through decentralization of information that we can do that. The diversifying of application in terms of planning processes for disaster risk reduction planning and its integration into development planning, including through financing measures, and also for preparedness and humanitarian action. And what is also very important is that there are many models which are being run and they produce good probabilistic results. But how do we ensure that they are robust enough? And the only way we can do that is to recalibrate them against existing historical databases. So the needs are rising. And before I move into the details of what exactly we are doing to meet these needs in partnership with UNDP, let me also point to some complementary processes that we are also ensuring while this is happening. The work on disaster-related statistics is very paramount because unless we standardize the disaster statistics and the quality of data that Debbie was talking about, we cannot actually produce quality data. To do this, an interagency expert group has been established, endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission last year, and 90 member states have already joined this consortium. And here we are talking about how to develop a framework for disaster-related statistics, which is already there, and how we can globalize it. James has already touched upon the hazard definition classification that we have developed jointly with the International Science Council. The emergence and adoption of the UN data strategy as a common framework across the UN system is another big opportunity that we would want to harness, and then complement it with more technology-driven processes like machine learning with geospatial methods, artificial intelligence, but at the same time also harness the good practices of standards and interoperability. Unless we make the systems interoperable, we will not be able to sustain any of them. That's how the world is becoming to be. And interoperability of systems and standardization of data go hand in hand. All of them, this needs more of capacity at the country level, at the national level, which in turn ensures government ownership. And unless we ensure that ownership, we will not be able to sustain the process. Next slide, please. So to do so, what we have done so far in the last couple of years, and that's under the leadership of my predecessor in the Bonn office, David Stevens, who was leading this process, partnership with UNDP and other colleagues. A discovery and needs analysis has been completed. We have the report now with us, and we are using it to inform the subsequent process. Many of the points that we have mentioned so far, both Rajesh and I, are actually the outcomes of this discovery and needs analysis. We have done rapid surveys with a lot of consultations. Around 30 countries have participated together with governments and stakeholders. And now with the result of this, we have drafted a roadmap. It is still not final, it's still in the process. But essentially what we are trying to do as part of this roadmap is to have an iterative and sequential process. In the first phase, we will see how we can meet the immediate needs of the countries by transforming DesInventar, essentially working with the statistics partners, co-designing and prioritizing the governance models, and optimizing the functionality of several tools, including interoperability with disaster-related statistics framework and interoperability with Sendai Framework Monitor. In the second phase, we'll try to look into the short-term change in terms of data protection processes, ensuring disaggregation of data, quality control, and also ensuring compatibility with PDNA and DALA outputs so that all of them can feed into disaster loss databases. And then moving on towards the next phase, we'll start working at the inter-country level interoperability, including with probabilistic risk models, and also with the climate processes, including how we can use these databases to inform the loss and damage discussion in the Warsaw Mechanism and Santiago network. So a lot of discussion is happening on the climate front while we have a huge amount of data, and data often becomes the common window of opportunity between the climate world and the disaster world. And in the longer term, we'll look into the larger governance model within the UN system and within the country system, how we can expand the stakeholder base, how we can ensure the inclusion of science and technology and civil society and the private sector. So all of these are the larger governance model that we will be looking in the longer term. So this is a work in progress. We still are working on it, and we will be very happy. Last slide, please. Next slide, to be in touch with all of you and ensure that we can work in partnership. This is my last week in my current role as the Deputy Head for Asia Pacific Office. Starting 1st of May, I'm moving to Bonn as the Head of Office, which in Bonn is the Global Center for Disaster Data and Sendai Monitoring, apart from climate action. So looking forward to be in touch with many of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rajesh. Thanks, Animesh. And Animesh, congratulations and good luck in your new role. Looking forward to working with you in your new capacity. And thanks for the really interesting presentation. I think for me, one of the key elements that comes across are, a couple of them are both the scale of the ambition and really what does need to happen at the global scale, but also that kind of that honesty in the sense of like that, we really do, we do need to measure and track performance, whether it's progress or not, and that implies this willingness to learn. And I think that is really a cross-cutting element of what we're all speaking to, which is to say, we know where we'd like to go, and that it will inherently involve some learning and improvement. And the best way to do that is, of course, by tracking that progress, by having the data to do so objectively. So thanks for really coming in strong on that element. So with that, we will now turn to our next speaker, which is Pierre from the World Bank's GFDRR, to speak specifically about this risk dimension and the risk data. So over to you, Pierre.
Thanks a lot, Justin, and hello, everyone. Really happy to be there, and already looking forward to following up with all partners, and because I think so what we just saw is lots of pieces of actually that big puzzle we are trying to build together, And so I'm going to show to you today what, from the side of the bank and GFDRR, what we are trying to actually do on the front of disaster risk information. So next slide, please. So my name is Pierre Chrzanowski. I'm part of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which is a unit, part of the bank, but actually also a global partnership program. So receiving money from lots of donors, managed with a group of consultative group managed by the bank, by UNDRR, lots of countries. So just to say that already that the collaborative approach is really key for us, and our mandate is to bring disaster risk, the science of disaster risk activities into World Bank operations. So that's really one of our key mandate. And as part of that mandate, we have another mandate which is about making sure that all what we do, all those disaster risk information, are easily available to clients, to the population, to partners, and so on. So just to say that we also, as the bank, the World Bank, has a strong mandate on open data policy, we also share that mandate. And of course, it includes the fact that we also need to work on standards. We also need to work on the way to serve those data to different partners. Next slide, please. So, and actually, we did a publication a few years ago in 2016 called Solving the Puzzle, which is actually relevant for discussion today, recognizing the fact that we are all working on lots of different data, on the past disasters, on the exposure, the people, infrastructure exposed to those disasters, on the risks, actually the information that we want to get from those past disasters, vulnerability of the people to inform risk. And so recognizing also the fact that we have many different systems, many different softwares, and also many different contexts where different type of skills, capacities, we don't have all the same levels of capacities depending on where we are. And so that we needed to work together on, let's say, improving, like building that puzzle in a way that we needed to improve the standard, we needed to improve the interoperability. So a lot of the things that you already mentioned. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about standardization, when we talk about interoperability, I think it is important to pause a second and to reflect on what it is really about. So for instance, when we talk about disasters, we might talk about the terminologies related to disasters. So are we using the same terminologies? Are we using the same terms when we talk about earthquakes? Are we using the same intensity measures, for instance, to describe a past event? Are we talking about, are we using the same standards for locations data? So for instance, when you want to describe the extent of a flood, what type of geographical information are you using? So just to say that when we are talking about standardization, we are actually talking about lots of many different things. And it's not only about the content of the data, it could also be about the way we describe those data so that other people can retrieve them. So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, that the standardization is quite a broad process, and that maybe sometimes there are gaps in the way we standardize system and data. Next slide, please. And so that project, which is called Risk Data Array, is really about that. It's really about standardization. So standardization of the risk data information that we need as part of World Bank and GFDRR projects, but also standardization in the way that we want to be able to like link or build that interoperability with other systems outside of our own sector. So what we have done during the past 4 years is to work with academia, people from UCL, Global Earthquake Foundations, and many others, to define a standard, to define the standard that could encompass the different types of data that we are working when we want to do, for instance, disaster risk assessments, when we want to explain risk to clients, to governments, to companies. So for that, we defined, first we defined the type of data we were actually working with. So we have hazard data. It could be past events, but it's also a lot about the future events. And so we, in the type of hazard data, we also include the probabilistic set of hazard data sets. We also have the data on exposure, so data on population, data on infrastructures. And I think there is a driver here to include also more and more. So historically, it was really about, like, for instance, financial data, but also just like census data. And more there is a driver to include, for instance, socioeconomic indicators to be able also to better understand the risk of certain type of population, for instance, displaced people, marginalized communities. And we have vulnerability data, which is a link between exposure and hazard. And all those three type of data inputs combined can help to produce risk information regarding projected losses. And the idea is really to build a toolkit so that we could actually use data from, for instance, DesInventar, MDAT, the data for the disaster risk assessments produced by the bank, so that we could improve the outputs for future studies, so that we could maybe use those different information in new tools, in new applications, also linking them, you know, to other kind of applications, maybe in the humanitarian sector. So that's really the idea of the risk data libraries, to become a piece of that standardization process that we are all working on. Next slide, please. And for that, I think we have already a lot of interesting features that can also maybe help other systems, the development of other systems. For instance, on hazard, we already support multi-hazard scenarios, for instance, with the possibility to have to define trigger events. So when you have an earthquake triggering a tsunami, we support different type of scales. We support the possibility to have several different footprints. For instance, for a volcano, you would want to know the different scenarios, and then you would have different footprints that you can use in your GIS system. For exposure, it's quite the same. So that we support different scales. We use a specific taxonomy that we have developed with the Global Earthquake Foundation, but that's something that is still work ongoing, and which already includes a lot of information regarding physical assets, regarding population, regarding critical infrastructure, regarding agriculture sector, and so on. So we have something, I think, which is missing, information on a standard on vulnerability. I think vulnerability, it's really, you know, a scientific project, something that a researcher are going to produce for a given area, a given context, and it's going to you will find that in a paper or within a CAT model, for instance. And so what we want to achieve is to be able to link the output, so the risk, to the vulnerability curves, for instance, that were used for that model. I think in terms, you know, of being able to replicate what has been done in the past in terms of studies, it is important to be able to link the different data sets together that were used. And lastly, on the risk itself, so we support different attributes for losses. So of course, all the attributes needed for, let's say, being able to develop financial insurance products, something that we do at the World Bank, but also to be able to have in those loss, what we call loss schema, also the data on the population loss, and again disaggregated at, for instance, the level of the type of population, like marginalized, displaced, so that type of thing. So again, I think one of the key elements of that schema is the fact that we are bringing together different types of data, and so that we are making sure that we can link the outputs, the results, to the data that we are used to produce that result. So something, again, we hope will be useful for others. Next slide, please. And so, I mean, while working on this, we really realized that there were actually different drivers of risk data, so different use cases, different interests in achieving this. And so one is, of course, the one from, let's say, the humanitarian sector, development sector, such as our different organizations. There is another one from, let's say, private companies, insurance, reinsurance companies, let's say, like market driven. There is one from academia, from the researchers, scientists that are working to improve models, that are working to include also the, the climate projections into those models. And all of those people, they are actually working on different parts of that disaster risk data landscape. But we still have some gaps. We have some gaps because we have lots of countries where there are not enough data, not enough capacity also to manage those data, to produce new data sets. And there are gaps because we have also lack of interoperability. And this is really, I think, one of the key elements of I hope, the discussion for today is how to make sure that we can improve interoperability through the use of maybe common framework, common standards. Next slide, please. So that's it. And so, I mean, Risk Data Library is still a very new project. So we started a few years ago. Sorry, we just achieved first research and development phase. So we already have a schema, a standard, a schema as a standard, let's say, available, of course, open source that you can find on our website. And the next steps are going to implement actually that standard. So for us, it means to develop our own platform where we will put all the data produced through World Bank projects. But what we want also is to build that as a kind of a toolbox that others could reuse. They could reuse the standards, they could reuse the tools that we are going to build around that standard. So we are talking about data packages in the way that we also want, to those different data sets to be more easily transfer from one system to the other. And so I like to also to talk about that. Like packaging or containers of risk data. Next slide, please. So it's just a snapshot of the current state of our risk data portal. So for now, it's just very simple open data portal. But what we want to do is to include also all GeoGIS features, let's say, so being able to preview the data, being able to have different data endpoints, like APIs, web services, and so on. So we are going to build that over the next months. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's it. So thanks a lot. So this is the Risk Data Library project, and I'm Pierre Chrzanowski, and again, very looking forward to talking with all colleagues about what we can do together. So thanks again, and thanks to you, Justin.
Merci, Pierre. Thank you so much especially for having given so much thought and attention to how we'll work together, how we'll communicate and share this information with one another once the data does become available. I think the standard dimension to it is a critical piece of this, and it's the rules of the road in a sense that allows us to really ensure that we understand one another, that there's sufficient amount of as you said, interoperability, transparency, and it allows, of course, then for much more efficient exchange, analysis, and use of information and increased uptake. I think this is another interesting dimension. I see an opportunity here in particular to make this bridge, as you mentioned, to the humanitarian sector more formally, and to really bring the human dimension, the human related risks into the picture. As you mentioned, quite a lot of work has been done, of course, by the private sector on economic risks, particularly to, of course, policyholders and to critical infrastructure and other assets. But the opportunity to bring this technology, these ideas and concepts and tools to bear for the humanitarian sector is obviously enormous and quite powerful, as both you and others have spoken to. Then our next speaker, Alex from the GPPi in Berlin, has had some audio IT technical issues. So I'm going to present one of his slides on his behalf, and I apologize because I'm sure he would do it far more elegantly than I will. But what Alex wanted to really do was to make the case for this kind of database and for the applications that it would then support. And what I think he wanted to really underscore was that as many of our panelists have sort of indicated or have made obvious, is that there are many, there's enormous potential here. And we often focus, of course, on what's needed at the technical level to make this happen. But Alex wanted to remind us to think really closely and to always keep the use cases front and center, so that we know what the purpose is that we're building these tools for and how we're applying the technology. So on the slide here, we see a number of these use cases that he thinks are critical for us to pay attention to, and that it can be supported through the development of a global database or global data on disasters. So I'll just quickly read through those. I know you can see them on your screen, but it's to really speed up the need assessment process. This is something that in the humanitarian sector has been a known challenge for quite a long time. But by using models that are well trained and validated with the historical data can indeed speed up this process. As several colleagues, particularly Leonardo, mentioned, this can definitely be used to validate and to initiate early action protocols. One thing that we'll come back to in the QA later, but it also gives us a sense of the historical trends and needs, including where things are going, where there may not have been manifest risk in the past, where we may see risk in the future due to the impacts of climate change. It's a question that someone had posed, and I'll invite certainly Leonardo and Jim to come in on that when we get to it. Then, of course, the need to innovate upon our existing systems for needs analysis. There are a number of different initiatives in this space, from the GIAF led by OCHA and the GMAC in specific relation to the COVID pandemic. But having this global data that can be shared is sort of the sine qua non, without which we really do have a hard time moving forward with that. And then something that Pierre mentioned again is about standards and quality that allows for comparability, so that we can meaningfully compare one crisis with another and the evolution of risks and trends over time. So having that validated comparable data is really truly essential. So with our last two presenters, we're going to shift yet again, and I wanted to consciously end with these two speakers because we've talked quite a bit about some hypothetical use cases and what needs to be put in place in order to support this work. But now we're going to see and hear from two colleagues who have actually made it work in their own specific cases. So first is my colleague from the Italian Red Cross, Lorenzo, who has some really impressive stuff to show us, and in particular, who has a story about how he was able to essentially create the incentive structure that enabled or that encouraged and allowed for local branches of the Italian Red Cross to collect and then share data at a scale that was not, that hadn't been seen before, and that was, but yet necessary for, particularly for the COVID response. So over to you, Lorenzo. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you, everybody. So the Italian Red Cross started to understand how to better gather information coming from the different branches more or less 10, 12 years ago through emails, through reports, and so on. Then in 2017, 2018, we started to create a situation analysis unit that is our information management team. So slide, please. to do that and to integrate it with disaster risk analysis and early warning systems, and to better understand the environment where we live on, and to integrate with civil protections and emergency management technical approaches, we define long-term scientific supports and agreement with different scientific partners, mainly the National Research Council and CIMA Foundation, and then other activities. This to enhance analysis of both the environment and of our response capacities to better structure our communication flow and our information management flow. Next. So what we created in the end is a fully remotized group of volunteers and staff split in different parts of the country that can support both area of operations in country or abroad and our emergency operations centers in transforming data into information and in dealing with analysis, with supporting through imagery, with supporting in developing plans and specific procedures, particularly when those procedures are operationally bound, like in COVID-19, where we had to define a completely new set of standard operating procedures to spread it everywhere. Next, please. But what we, the great advantage that we have as Italian Red Cross is to have a quite broad network of local and localized emergency operations centers. It's one for each branch, so we have a total of around 670 local emergency operations centers, plus the regional ones. There are other 22. We have quite a strong capacity to acquire information from the territory. So next, please. The difficulty is that in the past we were used to work using our command chain as also to transfer the information. So the local IOC transfer information to the provincial one, to the regional one, and then to the national one. What we tried to do in 2017 is to reduce this this levels and to identify a common reporting system that automatically transfer information to all the level above. So in this way, we have a quick reporting system that can identify, that can signal every or notice every event managed by local level, provincial, regional, and so on, and all the other levels are automatically informed. And the information management team is there to polish and to manage the system and to support visualization of this information. Next. This gives us the possibility to have a quite comprehensive data set and database of all the intervention we did in every configuration. So starting from pre-alert to emergency, to exercises, to mass gatherings events, and so on. And in this way, we can easily know that we have around 3,000 to 5,000 events per year at different levels. And we can make additional analysis compared to what happened in the country to see both if the system works and how much we are involved in the responses or in the pre-alerting process and so on. What we did is, for example, to create a specific tool for COVID-19 response because of the dimension of the response phase. So in order to ensure an effective response and to monitor what happened, for example, in 2020, that we had to manage more than 1.2 million intervention in the whole country with 1.2 million of working days in the country. Several field hospitals and other quite big infrastructure deployed. We decided to use the same system, but to separate it, to have it just for that specific emergency. And this is something that we will continue to do. So when we have a big event, we will use the same monitoring system, but specifically for that event. In this way, we can gather information. We have the possibility to put them together into the same database, but to keep things separate for having. So because we are in the end in a multi-hazard and multi-risk environment, so we have different events at the same time. Next, please. What we did is to work a little bit on the different tools, and we focus on using open tools, particularly with to understand how to create the systems, and from one side, considering we are part of the IFRC, part of the SIMS, we decided to use tools that already are used by them, and because if they're using it, it works, and in this way to simplify both training and processes. But we use a lot to Google Cloud. That is the main cloud system we have in Italian Red Cross, and so we decided to use some of its tools too. We decided to create some patches to import information coming from Kobo Toolbox to Google Spreadsheet, and sometimes we decided to use Google Form instead of Kobo for practicality reasons. Go ahead. What we created in the end is a very simple way, a simplistic way to for automatic aggregation of data, mainly using Google Spreadsheet. We are now using MySQL database, but technically speaking, Google Spreadsheet is good enough for our dimension, and it's easy enough to be managed by a group of IM trained personnel with scripts working on it. So the elaboration of the data through Google Data Studio is quite good for recitation, and is powerful enough to provide all the information we need for planning purposes and for operations management purposes too. Let's go ahead. Sometimes for more specific analysis, particularly when we need to go through in-depth assessment, we use different tools for, particularly when we need to have other organizations and our partners working for us, working with us and for us for analysis. So in this case, we decided to change a little bit the structure, but what I can assure is that the same data are then before aggregation and after transferred to the same database. So in this way, we can track all of them and continue to have a possibility in the future to use it for research purposes, analysis, and so on. Good. What we started to do is to integrate information and data coming from different sources, institutional particularly, or and what we gather from the field. This is sorry for Italian, but in the top side, these are information coming from our National Statistics Institute. And then there's integration of this data with data gathered by our branches and our assessment teams. Good. What we did, for example, for COVID is to compare the external data with our internal analysis. Particularly to show and to understand if our response and what we gather from our EOCs were comparable to the ongoing situation in terms of the severity of the epidemics, and in this way to understand and to try to modelize the curve of the response. Particularly splitting it in the different functions or sectors to better understand and to better plan for future operations. Go ahead. So some application of the database are both related to COVID and also something that we did and we normally do for our civil protection purpose. We support national DRA and early warning systems, gathering information, institutional information, but also developing tools for expeditive disaster risk analysis that can support at national level better understanding of potential scenarios, and can support local branches too in defining their contingency response and emergency plans. That's good. But what we did in COVID-19 response was more specific. We had to compare the different the evolution of the emergency with standardized model of emergency, in this case, slow onset long-term emergency, reshaping a little bit the curve during the different phases of the epidemics, of the evolution of the emergency, to analyze it, to understand what is obscuring what. When we have to shift, for example, from emergency medical service to welfare-related services, where we have to put the more weight, how to reorganize our EOC, trying to a little bit, at least, anticipate the evolution of the disaster, and to anticipate early recovery and transition phase as much as possible. Coming from there, we define a response strategy. This is, for example, the one I used in Lombardy region when I was in charge of the Italian Red Cross crisis unit. And in this way, with the possibility to provide not only day-by-day order to our local branches, but to provide a common and comprehensive strategy that can support their local planning and their operations management fully localized. Thanks. And this is another element that we did at national level. So thanks to our logistics units and the emergency area, where we have a supply chain manager, our job is done to understand the supply chain not only as a logistics tool, but also integrating the communication and information flow. In this way, we started analyzing the different steps, particularly when we had to focus on a donation, but also related to mobilization, to identification of the analysis, identification and analysis of the ongoing situation, working on training and so on, to create a unique supply chain that can support both acquisition of goods, acquisition, internal finance, internal management, in the idea to support better organized operations. Gathering data and monitoring both internal actions and activities, but also gathering data coming from the assessment and from the results of the operations in order to better monitor how we can reach people in need. And that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Lorenzo. I'm a very kind of concrete learner, and I think it's really always good to see, how things and how a lot of the concepts and the ideas that we've been discussing over the last hour or so have actually been put into place already. And I think this is, a really good example, or several examples of what that looks like in practice. So I really appreciate you taking the time to show us how you've done that. So thanks very much, and we really do look forward to building upon what you do. As I mentioned, I think you play a key role in the digital transformation and the peer-to-peer learning process within the Red Cross Red Crescent network. So thanks again. Finally, another application-oriented presentation from our colleague from the PDC Global in Hawaii, Cassie Stilo. Over to you, Cassie. I'm going to try to get your video on so that we can see you as well. So thanks very much. Over to you, Cassie.
All right, so next slide. So first I wanted to provide some background on some of the work that PDC has done and some of the information that we have available. So for those of you that aren't familiar with PDC, we monitor hazard events globally, pulling from the authoritative data sources for each hazard. So as part of our efforts to provide situational awareness, to support disaster risk reduction activities and really all phases of disaster management. And we update historical hazard layers annually for most of the events that we monitor. And so one of our goals in this process is to allow our partners to gain a better understanding recent impacts in a region. So by doing this process, we discovered that there was a gap. Our partners needed quicker access to information in order to understand potential impacts from past events and allow more informed decision making. So we decided to enhance our existing global hazards database by pulling from a variety of sources, including authoritative hazard-specific sources. So, USGS for earthquakes, National Weather Service for U.S. winter storms. We heard from CRED earlier, but we worked with them to gain access and download the MDAT database and combine that with our existing hazard data. And then we also have numerous country and regional level projects where we're actually working with, the national disaster management organizations within the countries, and they'll provide us their hazards database. So we've integrated quite a few country and regional level databases as well. So next slide. So this is more of the operational aspect and what, we really wanted to develop this database to support. So I guess this is a sneak peek because it's, it's coming out here in the next 2 months. And it's a product that we call Event Brief. And Event Brief is a report or product that is auto-generated. It's pulling from PDC's multi-source data feeds to provide this situation overview for current disaster events globally. And it's pulling from real-time information, and it does update as more data becomes available. So, for example, like a tropical cyclone or typhoon or hurricane, it will update as every new advisory comes in. So our goal with this product is that it could answer some of those key immediate questions like who, what, where, how bad, and as it can include estimated population exposure, needs, potential needs, impact to lifeline, what's the weather like on the ground. So next slide. So then a big part of that, and where it ties into this conversation, is that historical hazard section, and that's providing information on whether or not there were recent events in the area, and also what were the actual impacts from that event, and what might we expect with this similar event. So that all that data I was talking about on the last few slides, when an event occurs, we have an algorithm and it's going through our database to comb through and see, is it a similar location? Is it a similar magnitude, similar depth? And it'll pull out those events, and we can see, what were the impacts from that event, and even if there was an event within the last, month or so. So that's where, we're really excited to. I'm really excited to see all these different collaborations and see how we can even enhance this a bit more, but this will be coming out soon in PDC's Disasterware platform. Next slide. So we've come a long ways with our hazard database, and there's still some activities that my team is working on this year to ensure that we have, a streamlined process. So a key step in this was identifying a common data schema for our hazards that has key fields that we want to populate for all hazards. There's also some hazard specific fields that we want to make sure that we're filling. So for example, cyclones, we want to have like the Saffir-Simpson category. We want to have max wind speeds. We also want to make sure that we have, one event per landfall in the database. So like Hurricane Matthew hit a bunch of different countries, so we want to make sure that we have those different entries in there and they're linked together so that we can show the recent impacts for all of those different areas, since it's impacting such a large region. We are working to, a lot of this is automated already, but we're still working to augment and automate some of the actual event info in the database. So actual population and capital stock or infrastructure affected numbers, and ensuring that we're storing all of that key post-event data so we have it to reference later on. And to ensure that this process is sustainable, we have to automate these information data flows. So if a cyclone happens, we want that to, or an earthquake happens, we want that to immediately be available in the database and not have a delay, because, you know, one of the key features that we need is to see those recent disaster impacts. So that's what my team's really focusing on this year. And, you know, based on everything I've seen here so far and the great work that my fellow speakers have presented, I already have, you know, more key information that I want to start to integrate and pull together and work with everyone to enhance some of this data that we have. But that's, you know, I know that's a really quick overview, but if you have any questions, let me know. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cassie. Great to hear from you. Great to see what you presented there. I think we're all very excited to see that in production, so we can then begin benefiting from it as a community. I think at this point we can open the floor to questions and reactions from the audience. There have been a number that have already been posted, a couple have even already been answered, but we'll take these questions because we are amazingly exactly on time. So for the next 20 or so minutes, we'll make this more of an interactive Q&A, and then we'll close, you know, with closing remarks beginning in about 20 or so minutes. So there are a couple of questions, maybe. Cassie, while you're still on the line, about the integrated quality of this, you know, how much of this is already integrated? You spoke to this a bit, maybe if you want to care to expand on that. And then I believe also maybe in particular Pierre and Leonardo, if you're still there, I think maybe you want to also speak to this question about, you know, what do you think will be integrated? But of course others can come in too on that point. There's also another question that came up about, you know, this question about emerging disaster risks in places that haven't yet been hit. This is a perennial question in the disaster risk community, and is of course particularly relevant as we think of, you know, longer term into the future, and also about the impacts of both climate change, but also socioeconomic and demographic change. So if, again, I know Leonardo has worked a lot on that too, but Jim, feel free to come in. And then we can keep triaging as we go, but maybe let's start with those. Cassie, are you okay to take the one on integration, and then we can let Pierre and perhaps a couple of anyone else wants to come in on that point, follow you on that before moving on?
Sure. So we, you know, for integration, we're connecting to a lot of different platforms via existing APIs or agreements. We are making sure that we're, you know, setting up sustainable data feeds so that when we're pulling in this data, it's updating. And we are using, you know, all these other databases. Most of the presentations I saw today, we are trying, you know, to meet with and integrate their data into our platforms, and then also providing our data out via our standard APIs and making sure those are available. So I know that's how we're integrating it. I don't know, is there more you want me to touch on there?
I think that's good for now. For others who wanted to come in on integration, just unmute yourself. I'll see if you're unmuted. It looks like Pierre, you're unmuted. I can I'll have you come in on it.
Yes, thanks, Justin. And so maybe here it's important to try to distinguish the different ways we can integrate systems, right? And there are mainly two ways. One is to what we call the traditional data warehouse, where you, for instance, you have a system from PDC or a system that you are running for your own purposes, and you want to get and incorporate data from other sources. So for doing that, you're going to define your own data model, and you're going to make sure that the various data sources, you can plug to them. So you're going to develop like those interfaces between data sources and your own system. So this is a traditional way to do data integration, and so it's for your own system, your own use. Now recognizing that we are working together through the web and so on, there is another way to let's say work on integration, which is about making sure that those different pieces that we exchange, they are actually standardized. So let's say we are not going to focus only on our own system. We are also going to focus on those packages that we exchange together. And I think this is probably where we need to work on together, because we already have lots of great systems that can provide great insights. But if we are successful in building those packages that we can exchange, I think we can really liberate the value of all those data that are produced by various stakeholders. So that's just on data integration that I think that would be the way forward, let's say. And we already have lots of systems and data sources, but also formats for exchanging information. For instance, I think one of the best examples is the HTX platform. I mean, it's so great to have, all those information, for instance, on exposure for a given country that anyone can reuse. And I can tell you, I have many colleagues at the bank that are actually reusing those information because they are open, because they are provided in a standardized way, and because they are relevant for their work, they are specific to countries and so on. So I think that's the kind of best practices that we want to follow. Thanks.
Thanks, Pierre. I think, Jim, if you want to come in on this, there's also a follow-up question from an IFRC colleague, Luke, who posed to the chat, what tactics and incentives are you using to help drive the alignment around the data schema you presented? So if you want to come in at least on those 2 points, plus others.
Great, thank you very much. So the WMO Cataloging Initiative is a service to all the stakeholders within the disaster management as well as loss and damage accounting areas or disciplines. It is it's fundamental at the national level, meaning that the National Weather Service, National Meteorological and Hydrological Services of each country normally take observations like temperature, wind, pressure, etc. All of this is taken for granted in a sense. It just happens every single day, every hour, sometimes 2 times an hour. Satellite information, etc. What we are enacting here is augmenting our current operating system to record events, meaning hazard events, independent of loss and damage. So there's a library of events where loss and damage can be attributed to. Now, how is this standardizing information? The point here is to be able to, at the national level, create the synergy between the disaster managers or whoever is keeping the loss and damage information to work with or partner with the Met Services. In many countries, this has already occurred and will be further augmented. The system is fairly easy. It's only a question of appending in an existing database the identifier that is relates to the causal hazard for loss and damage. For instance, the unique identifier that allows for the ability to scale up to larger scale systems. So the incentives that we have are, first of all, our Met Services will be providing this information resource, which provides a historical database of meteorological, climate, hydrological, and even space weather events, so that everybody can be able to link it to this hierarchical structure or this linked structure. The incentives are that it will provide them a better database on their own side as far as impacts if they're linking to with this information, and allow them to be able to better classify systems or search particular hazardous events. I hope that answers the questions. Over.
Thanks so much, Jim. It looks like we have two questions coming in that can be synthesized around these issues of the reliability and quality of data from conflict or conflict affected or fragile settings, and another about data on a critical infrastructure. How do we ensure that it's this exposure data is kept up to date and that the vulnerability information is also up to date? I think on the first point, I'll turn to my colleague Lorenzo, who actually I know responded to the cyclone in Mozambique in a challenging environment. So if you want to maybe address that point, Lorenzo, and then Pierre, if you and others, maybe Leonardo want to come in as well. Thanks. Over to you, Lorenzo.
Thanks, Justin. So in terms of reliability and the quality of the data, we have different possibilities, or we rely on the fact that when we deploy personnel with specific tools and specific capacities for conducting an emergency needs assessment, then we in the end rely on the fact that this personnel is trained and this personnel is able to understand and to acquire information from there. But when and the same happen when we talk about, for example, situations that are more complex, like conflict, like for example, the concurrent Tigray response operations or things like that. Or we can, or we should rely on specific partners. They're already localized, they're already trained, and then can be identified as reliable sources. This is something that we do, for example, when we deal with our localized organization, but there's also we can do when we train different other national societies or different other organizations in providing information on a specific standards and in understanding the reliability of the information they are gathering. That's it from my side.
Okay. Thanks very much, Lorenzo. I think I'll turn now to Leonardo to come in as well on that same point. Over to you, Leonardo.
Thanks, Justin. So just maybe a couple of things. Of course, especially when it comes to a conflict setting, there are many more challenges when related to access to information, to the reliability and the quality. I would just maybe stress a couple of examples that are I think that can be seen as good practices. So one is a better use of new technologies. Right now with satellites, I mean, there's, especially when in a disaster setting, there's so much that we can do, and we can actually populate some of these databases, retroactively. Well, we don't have to open this, but that organizations are more and more using this type of technologies. And the other one that is and actually, I should also say that this is particularly a strength from IFRC, is to rely more and more on community-based surveillance and actually, empowering the population affected to report on impact. So, instead of actively running assessments and doing the usual needs assessment and impacts assessment, have put in place systems, for population affected to self-report to some degree needs impact. So these are maybe two tools that we have to improve access, availability, and reliability, and quality of data in conflict settings. I don't know if Justin, you want to move on to.
Actually, Leonardo, there's one question that came in. I think it's really one tailor-made for OCHA just a second ago, which is about, okay, if this information can be generated in the early stages of a disaster, the question I think is coming from UNICEF. In the first weeks, how can we improve sharing and use of this data and information? I think that's an OCHA question if there ever was one. So
yeah. I mean, this is exactly what we are, this is the main goal of, what we've put in place when we designed the humanitarian data exchange. So that's really the goal. So when we think about, humanitarian data, we have in mind 3 types of data. So one is data about the context, and we have agreed with, with humanitarian country teams and really across operations on what we call the common operational data sets. So this is really the minimum, set of data sets that is needed to for organizations to respond. The second is data on impact. And in this case, we're always, and this is kind of the shift that I was describing when I did my presentation. We are right now only mainly across organizations sharing data on observed impact. Now, what would be nice to see is organizations and technical partners sharing more and more information on projected impact, because for many events we have this, and like collaborating more at the level of risk analysis and projected impact is something that we definitely need to make progress on. I mean, there are good examples, but still is not easily accessible. And then data on capacity. So this is really like, one of the key elements when we support responses. So who's doing what, where, and when, so that it helps improving the coordination among partners. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leonardo. Next, we'll go to Pierre and then to Animesh, specifically with regard to questions about exposure of critical infrastructure and estimating the risks to those, and how do we keep this perhaps up to date, and then how do we also, of course, apply this in fragile environments. There's a last question I think we want to come back to at the end, and I may even come in too on it, which is about how do we kind of ensure that we go the last mile. We've talked about a lot of sophisticated things. Cassie and Lorenzo showed some really cool already working platforms or soon to be working platforms. But how do we ensure that the colleagues who really critically need this information, including in some very challenging contexts, can benefit from it and can access it and have this data when they need it? So we'll come back to that question before we close, because it's a really critical one. But over to you, Pierre.
Yes, thanks, Justin. So on exposure, and in particular on critical infrastructure. So first of all, I would echo what Leonardo just said. I think it is important that any type of tools that we build together can also be tools that can be harnessed by local population. And I think one great example of those type of platform is the OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap is a platform where anyone can actually add information on exposure, like on the buildings and any type of infrastructure networks. And it is used a lot after disasters event. It is used a lot also for actually critical infrastructures in country where you don't have access to national special data infrastructure. So that's a way to get those information, and I think it is important again to continue to support those digital commons to be able to have more information regarding again infrastructure and critical infrastructure as a network, as facilities, and so on. So there are possibilities, but for that you need the right tools, and you need the right tools so that people on the ground, they can also confirm that the information that we put there is correct. I think that's really key. And also because, you know, for instance, exposure information, but also vulnerability, they are dynamic information after a disaster. Vulnerability is going to change, like displaced people, it's dynamic vulnerability. Exposure, it's dynamic in the sense that you have a complete new setting just after an event, and you want to be able to understand that new setting, because then risk is going to change for the future based on that new setting. So just to say again that it is important to build those tools that really can rely on, and that are tools that allow that to capture that dynamic situations better. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Animesh, over to you. I know you wanted to also come in on this same point.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Just to reflect before I move to the critical infrastructure issues and exposure and losses, I wanted to touch base on the standardization and the importance of it. I touched briefly upon it during my presentation, but in context of integration, I see that the potential of integrated systems will increasingly becoming complex, because it will be difficult. It's an ideal thing to have, but it will be more and more difficult to actually achieve. And hence we should focus more on ensuring that the systems talk to each other, which is interoperable systems, so that data from one can be fed into the other for further analysis. And to do that, it's very important that we standardize the data. That's what I was mentioning in context of the disaster-related statistics work, the work WMO and we have done, including with ISC on hazard classification, so that we can have the data which can speak to different systems. And it's also very important from the view of disaggregation of data. At a higher level, it's easy to make comparisons. We can say that over a specific scale of time, the hydromet disasters have increased, but which kind of hydromet hazards have increased? And only through these granular comparisons, we can determine policy actions and implementation. And that can happen only if we standardize the different definitions of hazards. So that's just one quick point before just to build on what has already been said. But moving to the critical infrastructure, this is actually, I'll touch it from two aspects. One is the actual losses that are being recorded, and the second is the exposure, which are potential losses which might be recorded or might be realized in case a disaster strikes. The Sendai Framework's global target D is on disaster-related critical infrastructure and disruptions to basic services. And we have already reported in the last Secretary General's report last year about the level of disaster damage and losses in critical infrastructure. And the updated information will be released very soon at this year's SG report. Here, the mention of health and education has been made in particular, but it also gives the options to countries to report on protective infrastructure or green infrastructure where relevant. So this is about the information on loss and damage in context of infrastructure alone, which are being recorded. Then in terms of the actual recording or estimation of projected losses, it's very important that the work ongoing by several organizations that I know of in terms of super layering risk assessment information over exposed infrastructure is very important. This has been done for major ports in some of the zones I know in Asia, for example, wherein the annual average losses have been superimposed over infrastructure elements using geospatial technologies to come out with the potential losses which we might see in the future for infrastructure. But this has been done at a very random way in different areas of the world. And I think if we can move forward towards super layering information of the results of risk models over exposed infrastructure, only then we can know how this is being impacted. Some of this work is also going in context of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is co-led by UK and India. And we are part of, together with UNDP, World Bank and others as well. And some work on this is also ongoing there, the results of which should be out very soon. Over.
Thanks very much, Animesh. I think Lorenzo wanted to come back in on one of the points above. So over to you, Lorenzo.
Okay, thank you. So couple of questions. So the first one, is there any idea to develop a digital ecosystem for working on humanitarian emergencies or emergency management operations, in order to support common exchange protocols, common API rules, etc. More like a governance structure than like a website where you put your data on, but a system that can support the governance and the development of different tools coming from different organizations. Asking this because it's something that, for example, started out during Expo 2015 in Italy, and it's very useful to put together in critical infrastructure information, mass gatherings, event, companies, and so on together. And in this way, from a responder's point of view, there is a possibility to use those information, those data in a comprehensive manner and in better understanding what you're doing, what is going on, and so on. Also, another point I understood about how we design and we ensure that this information are proper for for those that are operating on the ground. From our side, because we are those that are operating on the ground and on the field. In the sense that when we talk about planning, I'm not talking about PMER, I'm talking about operational planning or emergency planning in terms of risk analysis and in case of operations planning. So the drafting the plan of the operation and supporting the evolution of the operation and supporting the assessment. So it means that all the personnel involved in the information management team is trained and is normally deployed for emergency operations and for emergency management. So in this way, we ensure that we already know what is probably needed, and at the same time, we work in the same emergency operations center with the guys that are managing the operation itself. So there is common definition and common ground where we work on when we work on designing the tool that we need for gathering information, and also the visualization. Thanks. Sorry.
Okay. No, thank you, Lorenzo, on that point. I think I'll just quickly address the comment from Stuart, who posted to the chat a specific question to Debbie, who unfortunately had to leave for personal reasons. Just to say that I think this is clearly not the final word on the collaboration. This is really it's not exactly the start either. A lot of us have been working together in the past, but it's a kind of a milestone to say, look, there's a real opportunity here to take this forward together in a more concerted fashion. And I think the question about implementation and how we're going to work together and how we're going to develop these things at different levels, which you touched upon, Stuart, is something that we'll obviously have to address in the weeks and months and even years to come. Lastly, just to echo Lorenzo's point there, coming in on how do we ensure that this information gets to those people who need it most, including in these challenging contexts. This is something at IFRC that we're very alive to. In fact, we're often there in many of the most challenging and difficult contexts. So we have to ensure that we keep the end user always in mind, a point that Alex made in his remarks. And whether that means we have to adapt these technologies and deliver them via SMS or other, even radio, then we need to kind of always bear that in mind, because we can't rely on the fact that everyone has broadband and smartphones everywhere at all times. So this is never lost on us. So before I kind of do a wrap up, I think I'll do a quick tour to the tablet to see if the presenters, who I'd like to thank again, have any final remarks that they would like to share. Anyone volunteering to go first? Just unmute yourself and I'll pick you. I'll come to you. Rajesh, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Justin, and it has been very interesting session with a lot of very interesting presentations and comments from colleagues. I just want to highlight, like at UNDP, we have been engaged a lot in countries in setting up nationally owned disaster loss and damage data systems. And my remarks are basically coming from that experience. I just wanted to highlight 3 or 4 points which have been very important in terms of building capacities at the country level. One aspect which we have observed is that in many times, especially on the governance aspect of DRR, in the legislation which guides the DRR agency in the country, there the whole data information management capacity aspects are missing. Because of that, these agencies do not derive that kind of legal power in the country to collect data, to analyze it and use it in the country. So that's one aspect. Secondly, I have also noticed in several countries, especially low capacity countries, we find that DRR agencies are very poorly staffed in terms of having any kind of IT capacity. So that makes it very, very challenging for them to utilize any kind of data information available even from regional or global sources. As a result, they suffer a lot in terms of performing their legally mandated role. Thirdly, the capacities are very, very poor in many countries, and the whole capacity, not just in terms of ICT, but also in terms of understanding various disasters, their impact on various sectors. All those things are lacking, and there is a dire need for enhancing capacities on various aspects in a lot of these countries. And lastly, I think the application aspect of whatever is available, whatever data is available from any source in the country or outside, even its application across various development sectors in the country, those are also very much lacking, because that way they are not able to establish the need for collecting more and more data. So consumption of data, utilization of data, whatever exists there, even in minimum form, is not done properly. So to me, these are the highlights of our experiences working in the countries. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. Anyone else want to come in with a final closing thought? Oh, Leonardo.
They can come in. So just so first of all, thank you all for the very interesting discussion. The only thing that I would like to stress is that, especially in the humanitarian sector, we've been talking for so long about integration between development activities and humanitarian activities, the nexus and so on. But I really think that especially given the trend that we are observing of humanitarian organizations doing a more risk-based interventions or activities, this is really I think a really concrete way in integrating the two aspects. So and that's really the thing that I would like to stress, is that having a better understanding of risk, having a better understanding of what happened in the past, what is the return period, what are the vulnerabilities and so on, is really the key to work jointly, development and humanitarian actors. Thank you.
Very well put, Leonardo, and I couldn't agree more. Anyone else before I wrap up? I can't see if anyone is unmuted. Go ahead and start speaking. Yes, go ahead.
Excuse me, do you hear me? Okay. Sorry.
Yes, we copy you, Jim.
I just wanted to make two quick comments, and that is that at the national level, the loss and damage recording and attribution to the causal hazard is critical, and that attribution needs to be done in a systematic way, and a lot of capacity development in countries needs to be done so that so the damages are attributed to the lowest level causal hazard. And WMO is trying to provide that hazard information, meaning that in a systematic way, so that disaster managers and everybody can attribute more accurately. Another aspect is the standardization of hazard names and definitions. That is critical. However, we need to pay attention that many hazard definitions hazard definitions can be country specific. For instance, heat wave, cold wave, that means different things to different people. And we have in WMO tried over the years to create a global identifier or a global definition of what a heat wave is. But it's very difficult because in Greenland, a heat wave is different than what it is in Saudi Arabia. And so we need to pay attention to other hazards as well. For instance, tropical cyclones, there are differences in definitions and how they are measured. So we need to pay attention to that in any database that we collect. It needs to be focused on the country level, but being able to expand out to the global level. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Again, great points, and couldn't agree more. Animesh, I noticed that you just turned your video on. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, just a point which I haven't mentioned earlier, but building on what Rajesh was also mentioning in terms of demonstrating the application of the data. Unless we do that, we will not be able to sustain. And during our discovery and needs analysis that we completed last year, one of the very interesting results was that the producers and the users of disaster data are not the same. While the NDMOs are the top producers of data, they lie on the bottom when it comes to the users of data. And that goes on to show how informed our governance mechanisms are. So while the scientific community appear to be on the top users, but then their research which comes out isn't really often translated into action, which is the work of the government. So this is a gap that we have to fill, that how we can capacitate the governments in using the data, but then it will happen only if there are regulatory mechanisms and a proper data governance mechanism that is followed so that this is done. And hence it points to the need for not making the entire discussion very technical, not a very software-centric discussion. It's about a data ecosystem. It's about how we can make this data system interoperable across climate change world, across the humanitarian world and the development world, so that we can have the audience and the right target people so that they can start using it. And only then we can move forward towards a sustainable way of working. Over.
Thank you, Animesh, for the excellent point as well. Pierre, over to you.
Yes, well, I first of all wanted really to say thank you, Justine, and all the participants for that great discussion. As you know, I mean, we are not a humanitarian organization, but we are certainly working on disaster risk and reduction. So, I mean, I will be looking forward to working with you all on that, and I would welcome any concrete next steps. So something we would have to define together, but I think we need to, if we want to foster collaboration, we need to find those concrete items that we can work together. Another thing, talking about climate change and so on, obviously at the banks, I mean, we have lots of teams working on different issues, and also very happy to help to make some links with other initiatives within the bank. So that's what I wanted to say, and yeah, again, looking forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Pierre. I'll follow up on your point about concrete next steps in just a second or so. But before I do so, I would like to again just thank the presenters for making the time today and in the evening for some of you to be here with us, as well as to all of the audience participants for joining today. And again, to our hosts, OCHA and SDC. Coming back to this point about concrete next steps, I think it's clear that there's a lot of potential here for working together more closely. I don't think we need another new interagency plus initiative that is formalized and becomes a burdensome process, because we all have so much already going on, and there's already so much momentum to build upon. So in terms of a concrete next step, what we can certainly volunteer to do is to call for a technical meeting and a mapping to kind of really identify, really clearly, some of the use cases and who's doing what on which elements, which pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. So we have clarity on that, and we can move forward, in as concerted and coherent as manner possible, and to identify where there are still gaps, of course. And then I think once we have that clear understanding, we can continue to evolve this as we work together, and of course bring new partners on board, because of course not everyone who has something relevant to say was able to, of course, be on the panel today. So we will of course continue reaching out then to those other relevant stakeholders and institutions. So with that, we will see you again, particularly those of you who are speaking today and representing your institutions. I thank you again. We will follow up with you to keep this moving forward and to keep the momentum going and to keep it moving in the right direction. And thanks to all of you. And we hope you have a good end of your week and rest of the HNPW this coming season. And with that, we close the session. Thanks.